Last year, I made a video discussing the WOOTIng 60HE analog keyboard. And in that video, I talked about how impressed I was with the keyboard in general, how high quality it was, and also how I felt the analog nature of this particular device really did help a content creator like me create smooth and viewable footage when playing games. I also suggested that I felt it was going to give me an advantage in certain types of games where analog inputs are useful. For example, driving or flying games. And whilst I did try it out, I'd only just gotten used to the keyboard and still couldn't say for sure how much difference it was going to make. And I promised I would get back to you a short while later. Obviously I broke that promise because it's not been a short while, but I promised I would get back to you and tell you whether or not I felt it actually gave an advantage in those sorts of games. And I can tell you, having played a lot of games now, especially Cyberpunk 2077, the analog nature of this keyboard is absolutely brilliant. Not only can I make far more viewable and less jerky footage when playing the game, which is great for me, I also feel like I drive vehicles in the game way better than I ever could with a normal digital keyboard. And whether you're racing through the city at high speed or you're just slowly crawling along, listening to the radio and taking in the sights, it is so much easier to drive the vehicles with this keyboard. You've got much more control when cornering, but especially when just dodging in and out of traffic, when you've got to make those small little adjustments. You've got so much more fine control. It is way easier to match another vehicle's speed. So if you're in traffic or you're trying to follow a car to hack it, you can match its speed without constantly sort of accelerate, brake, because you've got an analog keyboard. It really is night and day, and driving in Night City became one of my favourite parts of the game. But don't get me wrong, this is not as good as using a steering wheel in a racing game. That's probably fairly obvious. The keys only have a travel distance of 4mm, so depending on how good you are at controlling your finger and pressing down, you really only have a certain level of control. But it's enough that it makes a huge difference, especially when doing the fine little small movements, but even at high speed. In the original video, I discussed one of the techniques that people using a digital keyboard often use in games like this, where you're driving and you can't switch to a steering wheel because it also involves getting out of the car and running around. What we tend to do is, if we want to accelerate but not as much as full acceleration, we sort of tap the accelerator and just keep tapping it on and off. If we want to turn in a certain direction but not full lock, we tap the key. What I will tell you is I still did that with the analog keyboard, but it wasn't so much because it was a habit, it was because I sort of needed to constantly adjust little by little. But what I can tell you is, because the keyboard is analog, adjusting it little by little when turning is so much smoother than on a digital keyboard. Because instead of going between full lock nothing, you're just doing small little adjustments. Not as smooth as a steering wheel, but way smoother than a normal keyboard. It was a lot easier though to temper the acceleration, to pick a speed and match the vehicle in front of you. I didn't need to tap that at all. That became second nature. One other thing of note when playing Cyberpunk 2077 is, because this keyboard mimics a controller, and the controls for controllers in games such as this are often either hard-coded or at least very difficult to change, there can be an issue with different controller inputs being set for movement on foot than when in a vehicle. So for example, in Cyberpunk, if you are using a controller, the left thumbstick controls your movement backwards and forwards. But if you're in a vehicle, acceleration and brake is actually set to the triggers. What this ended up meaning was I would need 2 profiles to play the game, and I would have to switch between them quickly. Now originally, before patch 2.1, I actually figured out how to remap the controller settings in the XML files so I could use 1 profile. But after one of the updates, that became next to impossible. I couldn't figure it out, so I did end up using 2 profiles. But it's not that big of a deal because I set the Windows key, or the WOOTING key on this keyboard, to basically switch between those profiles, and I had a different LED setup for both profiles, so I knew immediately which profile I was using, and it just became second nature. I'd hop in a vehicle, press the button, and now I'm on my racing profile. I get out of the vehicle, I press the button, I'm now on my normal walking around profile. However, that little complication aside, I would never go back to a digital keyboard for playing this game. In fact, if I can possibly use an analog keyboard for every game going forward, I will. If there's any sort of first person or third person movement control, I'm going to want to use the analog side of this keyboard because honestly, it is brilliant. Both in making viewable footage, but also in just having a bit of an advantage when playing games like this. Now, before I go, I did actually mention that I would probably evaluate using this keyboard for flying games, and I was going to use Starfield, but I have to tell you, the Starfield mouse and keyboard controls for spaceships absolutely did my head in. I hated it with a burning passion, and I managed to set up a system where I could use my joystick and the keyboard as well, but it didn't really take advantage very much of the analog nature of this keyboard. So I can't really get back to you on that. And I'm never ever trying to fly anything again in that game with mouse and keyboard. That is how much I hate it. So, in conclusion, the WOOTING 60HE, the video I made, everything stands as is. It is an absolutely brilliant keyboard. I can tell you it looks brilliant still. I probably should give it a clean, although it doesn't even look that dirty. I've got some key lube that will help me lubricate the keys. I've not felt the need to do that even after, I think it's 14 months. And the keyboard still feels very solid. And honestly, I will not go back. I love this keyboard. I love playing games like Cyberpunk 2077 on it. And yeah, a big thumbs up from me.